is Robert Benson, who is the Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture, who will be speaking on Boston 200, a footsore tour. Bob Benson.
Thank you, John. That's a tough act to follow. I'm afraid Boston, while I'm very fond of it, can't hold a candle to the romance that Paris has. But on the other hand, during the decade of the 1960s and for the early part of the 70s, and still to a certain extent today, a great many very exciting things were happening there. I was physically present there myself as a student for most of that time, and I had some rather unique opportunities to watch famous buildings come up out of the ground, whole districts either be wiped away or reintegrated into the city fabric, or totally new concepts be implemented. It's always been a bit of a desire of mine, partly because I'm very fond of Boston and the Boston area where I grew up, to take a tour of it someday, and in a rather orderly fashion, and start at one point and end at another, with the idea that there would be scenes for me to look at various points in time when I was feeling a little homesick, which still occurs occasionally, or to use as instructional material, or just to put together a slide presentation which might be able to tell someone a little bit about what the new Boston looks like, as opposed to the old, rather hidebound, decaying Boston that I knew when I was a teenager and younger. When I entered college, the redevelopment authority had undertaken a great many very ambitious plans with varying degrees of success. But the overall effect was to change Boston from a very dull, crime-ridden place to stay away from, even by people who lived in Massachusetts, into an exciting, vivid, dynamic, crime-ridden place to enjoy. So without further ado, this is just going to be just what the title implies, a walking tour. And we will start at the base of the peninsula which forms Boston and progress down toward the waterfront on a steady pace, which unfortunately took me 2 very hot days last July to accomplish, but which I've tried to condense into about an hour. And I'll warn you all in advance, if anyone has to be someplace, it will take about an hour to get through the slides. So, can we have the lights? Okay, this early map of the peninsula of Boston, it wasn't really much of a peninsula then, it's that little island up in the center with that very tiny neck of land connecting it to the mainland. Pretty much surrounded by the harbor on all sides. A great deal of what you see as water there on that particular map is now solid land, as you can see from this photograph. The contours of the peninsula have been very much rounded off, regularized. We're looking at the large body of water in the foreground is the Charles River, which was dammed a number of about 50 years ago and turned into a very nice place to be, Bonnet Shores. On the right-hand side of the river is located the Charles Bank, which contains the Hatch Memorial Shell, where the Boston Pops Orchestra performs many outdoor concerts. Anyone who saw the bicentennial presentations may remember the concert which took place from there. In the extreme background is Logan Airport, and sprouting up like so many spikes out of the fabric of the city is the new Boston. What we're going to do is start about the lower right part of the picture. Unfortunately, I didn't have an aerial view that included the area that we're beginning from. Progress in a line parallel with the grid pattern which you see on the lower right third of the picture, and incidentally I might add that's the only grid pattern anywhere in the city of Boston. The rest of it is a bunch of cow paths that have been paved over. up through the large green open space in the central portion of the peninsula, which is the Boston Common, down through Government Center, and then we're going to hang a sharp right and head out to sea, down to the Waterfront Park and the waterfront towers. This little kiosk is one of the items which the city has used in their Boston 200 celebrations of the bicentennial to accommodate tourists. They're rather nicely done, designed by, I believe, by the Cambridge 7, who has also remodeled their transit system, not only architecturally, but in terms of graphics. And these are located all over the city. They usually contain a map of the transit system, a map of the city peninsula itself with an indication of where you're located relative to the rest of the city, and a close-in map which not only identifies the immediate area that you're standing in, but tells you something about its historical aspects and also what it's well known for today. It's a very nice system. They use a lot of them, and very helpful, in addition to the famous Boston Freedom Trail, which is sometimes a row of red bricks and sometimes a line of red paint, depending on how much money they had, to thread your way through the historic areas of Boston. This map, which I photographed off of one of the little information kiosks, shows the area we'll be starting to walk from in the extreme bottom of the picture, which some of you may be able to read the word symphony. We will progress up toward the center of the picture, past those 5 little blue dots, the Prudential Center, over to Commonwealth Avenue, which is a parkway, up through the public gardens in Boston Common, still heading toward the top of the picture and slightly to the right. We'll reach the Government Center, which you can see labeled. It's the rather large open space in the center of the peninsula. And then we'll head out to sea, as I said, turning a sharp right and head for the aquarium, which is where the walk terminates. A number of the aerial photographs that I'll use on this screen to help orient us were taken from various high-rise buildings, some from planes. This is from the top of the Prudential Tower. And I merely include it just from the point of view of a landscape architect so that those students who are here in landscape architecture can get an idea of what the Back Bay Fens looks like. But the area we're more concerned with is what you see now. We'll be beginning at the Symphony Hall, which of course is the home of the Boston Pops Orchestra and the Boston Symphony Orchestra. It was a 1901 structure designed by McKim, Mead & White. And directly across the street from it is Horticultural Hall, which is almost identical in vintage, and a new apartment structure designed by TAC in the early 70s, may be seen in the background. The apartment slab is, of course, the large building in the upper right-hand portion. What we're going to be doing is passing in front of that, along in front of the rather large front lawn, which the Christian Science Mother Church has established and held, in front of the church itself, and then through this rather modern complex designed by I.M. Pei's office, down toward the administration tower, which you can see in the lower left corner of the picture. The Christian Science Complex also decided to put up their own little kiosk, which is rather nice. It's fortunate that it somewhat ties in with the graphics that were used by the city and serves an equal function. It's a very powerful thing to see as you cross the street, and I might add, take your life in your hands, which is a standard practice in Boston. Very much a wedding cake sort of structure, not in the Victorian sense, but in the idea of tier after tier of white stone piling up to this very dramatic dome at the crest, and the less dramatic Prudential Tower in the background, of course. Really rather beautifully done. They are having some structural problems, I think, with the rotunda or curved porch, which you see projecting toward you. They're in the process of trying to glass it in, and I gather from what I saw when I was there that they were having some problems. This alley of trees passes between the church structure itself and the library structure, I believe, which is in the lower right foreground. Marvelously kept grounds, beautifully detailed materials, very nice job all the way through. We're now passing in front of the church, and looking back, you can see the corner of Horticultural Hall, and in the extreme right of the right-hand screen, Symphony Hall. There's an auditorium which we'll be moving toward. And as we pass around the corner of the church, the first thing that grabs your attention in the foreground is the administration tower. It's a beautifully detailed concrete structure, just very elegant in all ways, proportions, location, the entire works. In the background, you can see the rather famous John Hancock building, 60 stories, now sheathed in glass instead of plywood. I moved over in front of the auditorium, which is the quarter circle structure in the central portion of the picture, and we're looking across the reflecting pool down toward the Prudential Center. Very elaborate floral displays are maintained at all times of year when the climate permits. Beautifully maintained, self-watering, very well thought out. Looking back the way we came, you can see a glimpse of the TAC design department structure in the background. Now we'll be moving toward the administration tower, and in the background you can see some of the less well-designed buildings of the Prudential complex. It's unfortunate that these things do form a background to such high-quality architecture as we have here. So, the administration tower is extremely dramatic. A lot of things happening that you don't normally expect to find on a typical high-rise building, and all accomplished with a rather great degree of elegance and flair, I think. Immediately at the base of the towers is an extremely elaborate fountain, which you can see in the foreground here. Very large, and deliberately, I hope, designed so that people can sneak in between the various jets of water and cool themselves off. When I took this particular picture, it was about 95 degrees, and it felt like it was about 105. And there were a good many kids in there just splashing around and enjoying themselves. The water is not allowed to pool very much, but it splashes, and it's fun dodging the various jets.
Who designed the site?
Beg pardon?
Who designed the site?
Pay's office, as far as I know.
I thought it was design.
That could very well be. I don't have the names and designers of all the things I'm going to show you at this point. At any rate, it's a marvelous fountain, and just very nicely done all the way along. Considerable amount of wind-blown spray can cause a problem, but on a hot day, you don't really mind that very much. We're moving out of the complex through the wet area, which you can see at the fountain itself. The addition to what I believe is the library structure is on the right. Again, another nicely detailed structure, very sensitive handling of the lighting and so forth. And of course the half-round alley of trees which has been established at the to indicate the boundaries of the project. It's rather unfortunate that there's a very, very busy 6-lane street which separates the Christian Science complex from that of the Prudential Center. It's a real trial to get across the street. And you see a little bit of the kind of Chinese wall that it forms between the Prudential complex and the religious center. The walls are very actively used as seating. We're almost out of the area now, and you can begin to see the hulk of the Prudential Tower looming in the background. 50 stories. In its defense, I would have to say that it was really got the renewal effort in this part of Boston underway. The entire site used to be railroad yards, and while it's unfortunate that a much superior scheme designed by Gropius in the early 50s was not constructed, this complex of the mid-60s and late 60s has done a great deal to revitalize this part of the Boston area. You could wish that the buildings had a little bit more distinctiveness to them, but I guess it's a trade-off between getting things going and not having any activity at all. We are now going to be moving past the Prudential Center, which I deliberately did not give too much space toward Copley Square in the Back Bay area. I slipped in this one slide of the Back Bay area to show you how the regularity of the street pattern in this one single area of Boston, and incidentally the broad green boulevard in the lower right part of the picture is Commonwealth Avenue, which we'll be moving along before too long, And the Charles Bank, what a marvelous setting it gives the city, completely surrounded by water, almost literally, and excellent views abound in every direction. We're kind of approaching the Copley Square area from the back door. You can see it in the lower right portion of the picture here, and I think I've got these out of sequence. Yeah. Just came up the earthquake. We just came up the street on the right of this rather massive open court building in the lower center of the picture. It's the Boston Public Library. As you come around the corner of that structure, you encounter Richardson's famous Trinity Church, designed in 1874, has just finished in conjunction with Copley Square itself, a very beautifully done job of sandblasting, repointing, and so forth. When I first knew the church, it was kind of a mottled gray all over, and when they finally got the thing cleaned, all these marvelous tones of vari-colored stone appeared, and some really rather vigorous patterning happening made a really beautiful end result. You can see the edge, the knife edge, I probably should add, of the Hancock Tower, kind of edging its way into the square, looking like it almost like to slice off the church right at the root. The sheer massiveness of the building, I'm sure, is quite obvious from the slide on the left. It's, I guess, fortunate that it does have the mirror skin on it. It does help reduce the apparent bulk of the building. It's still a big hunk, though, and it totally overpowers the surrounding scale of the square, which you can see is quite low rise for the most part. We're now passing along the front of the Boston Public Library. It's unfortunately not visible to you in the slide on the left. Some very nice detailing in the form of cast iron lanterns. This also is a McKim medium white structure. Forms one entire wall of Copley Square, and a very elegant wall, I might add, too. The addition which was put on it by Philip Johnson in 1971 is less successful, but it still is at least in scale with the surrounding area. Starting to cross the street to the square itself, you can see the Copley Plaza Hotel on the right. And when we finally get in the square, you can see how it's fortunate that the walls have been somewhat raised so that there is an illusion that the plaza is not completely cut off from its surroundings. This was a scheme done by Sasaki's office in '69. It was a low-budget job, and in the course of design, after the award was given to Sasaki to produce final design, it was cut once more. The result were things like the use of concrete instead of granite, and the use of an asphaltic paving block, which you can see in this picture, instead of a brick paver. On the whole, however, the results were still quite excellent, and the quality of the designs, I think, speaks for itself. When you're in the plaza itself, which is somewhat sunken, you're very, very much removed from the heavy traffic which completely surrounds it. In the foreground here, as we approach the church, you can see one of the little information kiosks that I showed you earlier. Just another shot of this slim edge of the Hancock Tower. It is fortunate that at least the narrow side of the building was placed adjacent to Copley Square. It's not a badly designed building, really, as far as an example of its kind. It's also by Pay's office, but it's typical of the kind of problem that you get when high-rise structures invade a traditionally human-scaled neighborhood. Unfortunately, the fountain was not running at full capacity. Normally, that top pedestal there is just gushing water in every direction, and the pool is full, usually filled with children as well as water. It's a delightful fountain, and when you see it working properly, it really, like all fountains in hot weather, is a very welcome addition to the cityscape. We're looking back. You can see the main facade of the Boston Public Library, a nice structure, and certainly walls in this edge of the square very effectively so that there's not too much in the way of leakage around the edges, except at the one corner here in the lower right, where there's a diagonal street that goes off and injects an awful lot of traffic into the general area. I might add that originally that street cut at a diagonal clear across the front of the church, so what is now Plaza area was nothing more than a traffic island. The plaza has rather nice little details like a small grove of trees as you get near the parish house, and of course the statue of Phillips Brooks, whom I believe was the original minister in the church. As you move past the back of the tower, you get a glimpse of the entrance plaza of the Hancock Tower. At the time I was there, it had just been opened to the public and had been declared to be safe. There were no longer panes of glass falling from various heights. It's kind of interesting, the little entrance canopy that they put on it, clear plastic half domes, which I suppose are effective. I must personally feel that they look a little bit like telephone booths, but nonetheless, the overall effect is pretty spectacular. Okay, now we're going to move away from Copley Square area and into the Commonwealth Avenue and Back Bay section, which we will progress down and eventually wind up on Boston Common and the Boston Public Gardens, which you can begin to see in the background. This is Bonwit Tellers. Some of the girls in the audience may have heard of it as being a very famous women's specialty shop. It was originally the Museum of Natural History in Boston, designed in 1862, a very elegant structure and beautifully detailed. Another interesting structure in the general area, and if I've got my bearings properly, you can see the spire in almost the exact center of the picture, is a church which was partly demolished by fire at the beginning of the decade. Paul Rudolph was the architect, and rather than demolish what remained of the original structure, they took the parts that were still reasonably sound and built a new church in back and around them, so that there's still some maintenance of the original feeling of what happened at that point in the city fabric. It was fortunate that the steeple did survive, and he managed to get some rather spectacular architectural effects by leaving the what portions of the original structure intact. Now we're on Commonwealth Avenue, which is the long strip of trees you see stretching across, on a diagonal across the center of the picture. This is a boulevard center park strip. It is 240 feet wide. It was designed at the end of the last century by Frederick Law Olmsted, who used it as a transition from the public gardens and the common into the more naturalistic areas of the Fenway and the various chain of parks that Olmsted designed, which still encircles the city of Boston. It's a very nice place, rather old-fashioned in feeling. Fortunately, a number of the elms, which have been so disfigured by the Dutch elm disease, still survive here. Quite littered with statuary. It seems that every place you turn, there is a statue of some famous person. And none of them given rather grand treatment, but just sort of plopped there as exclamation points at various places along this little mall. Of course, well, it's not little, but it bounds with dog walkers, mothers with young children. The Back Bay area has survived very, very well as a residential area and now commands extremely high prices. I had some friends when I was in school that used to live there, and I spent a lot of pleasant hours in that area of the city. We're now going to move into the Boston Public Gardens. It has been around for a long time, but in its present form, it dates from about 1900. It too is filled with some rather old-fashioned plantings, very Victorian in feeling, the little black chains, rather ornamental wrought iron posts, and these weird plants that they've used at various places, very colorful and very nicely maintained. Oddly enough, people don't seem to go after the planting displays with an eye toward vandalizing them at all. Every time I've ever seen the place, it's been in extremely good shape. Rather sylvan in effect. As you get into the public gardens, you begin to be walled away from the surrounding city, which is actually fairly easy. Most of the buildings in the immediate neighborhood are quite small in scale. Of course, as you get farther away, the Hancock Tower begins to emerge, and as we get a little further up onto Boston Common, you'll start to see the Prudential Tower in the background also. It's a rather beautiful little suspension bridge, and it actually is a suspension bridge. Was built as a pedestrian footbridge over the Swan Pond, and on the right-hand side of the screen you can see the rather famous swan boats which you get into and sit on, and a fellow mounts one of the swans and pedals, and away you go for a short ride around the pond. Some of you may remember a book from your childhood called Make Way for Ducklings, and at least I hope you do anyway, and it was illustrated and written about a family of ducks that made it home on the island in the center of the swan pond. Not too many keep off the grass signs, fortunately. People tend to ignore them anyway, but the grass seems to have survived fairly intact with or without people. Well populated at almost all times of the day, not just lunch times or when people aren't at work. You see a lot of family groups and a lot of just plain loafers, and not to mention a few derelicts. Okay, we're now moving into the Boston Common area. The Common is not maintained nearly as well as the public gardens. Part of that is because it is the roof of a parking garage, which extends underneath that entire open area which you see in the central portion of Boston Common. It's extremely heavily used. The maintenance problems with it are almost insurmountable. Just floods with people at various times of day. Number of nice pieces of statuary or rather odd little band shells are scattered around the area. This particular area, although there weren't too many loungers in it when I was there, is normally literally covered with drunks lying and enjoying their noonday rest on the benches. Occasionally the small orchestras come up and still have concerts there which are open to the public free of charge. They managed to build a small adventure playground into one portion of the Common. Unfortunately, looks like they ran out of money before they could really finish it properly, but it's there. This is what's known as the Frog Pond. It's nothing more than a giant concrete basin about 6 inches deep in most of its area, and a big spray fountain in the center that works as a swimming pool for, I'd say, half the children that live in that area of Boston. As we move toward the State House, and unfortunately it was a little bit hazy, you can't see the dome too well, but it's in the upper right-hand third of the photograph there. And incidentally, that gold on top of the dome is not gold paint, it's gold leaf. And it is redone at regular intervals to keep it looking goldy. I'm not sure who pays for it, but it's a nice tradition anyway. The fountain is a Victorian type, rather simple. Not very splashy, but still very pleasant to have around. It's looking back from this point. We're almost off of the Common now. You can see the old Hancock Tower, and in the background the new John Hancock building, and looming over there in the foliage on the right-hand side is the Prudential Tower. We're now getting into a portion of the Common that is fairly well maintained, partly I suspect because a good deal of it is paved, which is almost a necessity with the numbers of people there. And you see the Park Street Church, a very distinguished structure, and one which I might add, they did a recent addition to it that appeared in one of the magazines, I'm not sure which one. The spire of the church you can see in the central portion of the picture, with the Common in the background and Commonwealth Avenue, the tree-lined boulevard stretching away into the distance. Over to the left, of course, is the area that we've already walked through. Oops, sorry. It's a beautifully detailed structure. I'm not sure who the architect is. I think it was Bullfinch, who also designed the Massachusetts State House with the aforementioned gold leaf dome. It was totally draped in bunting when I was there in July, and it seemed like there was some kind of patriotic thing going on every other second. Whether it was a fife and drum corps marching up and down or whatever, it was always something happening. And of course, hordes of tourists around. Looking back, after I've left the Common and crossed the street, you can see two little subway structures. These, I believe, are now National Historic Sites. Boston had the first subway in the United States. It was built in 1898. And they've always rather reminded me of the Boston Public Library, and I sometimes wondered who actually designed them. They are protected now and maintained in a fairly decent condition, except for the ample supply of graffiti, which is all over every wall. We're now going to move down the street which leads into the government center from the most dramatic, gives you the most dramatic entrance to government center. We're looking back at the Park Street Church, and unfortunately you can't see it from this view, but there's kind of a canyon-like street that runs from the steeple over to the extreme right of the picture behind this high-rise building, which you see almost at the edge, and just sort of pops you out into government center. It's a very dramatic experience, and if you've never seen the place, you're confronted with one of the major buildings of the 1960s, which I'll show you in a moment. In the meantime, however, you go past the Parker House Hotel, which is the medium-sized structure in the background, and King's Chapel, which I found endearing. Oops, this is a view down the side street at the old State House, rather dwarfed by its present surroundings, and rather vigorously renewed in its own area itself, I might add. Complete with arcade leading down to the government center. You can see the Boston City Hall in the background. I wanted to put this little side trip in here just to show you that there had been several rather carefully thought out ways arranged to arrive at government center. This is perhaps less dramatic than the one I'm going to show you in a minute, but it has its value. King's Chapel again on the right here in the foreground, and you can begin to see the edge of the City Hall peeking out from behind that one structure in the background. The structure which you see on the left is One Center Plaza. Sorry, my New Englandese is showing. With the Beacon Hill Theater recessed into its base. It was an interesting building in the sense that it was built in a very broad arc to maintain the flow of the street and kind of assist you around the through this cave, which is Tremont Street, almost sunless at all times of day. And all of a sudden it pops you out into this tremendously scaled open space. And the curve of the building works very effectively as a kind of a preliminary element to get you in there. In the background, incidentally, you can see the Old North Church, the spire of which was illuminated by several lanterns in recent history, I believe. One of the more charming aspects of Boston is the rather interesting little footnotes that happen. I really love this little tombstone that was put up to caution the pedestrians as what you can't do. If anyone wants to know, it reads, "Restrain thine passions here. Police taketh notice," and some of the language is a little bit on the cute side, but on the other hand, the entire burial ground is filled with stones of this nature, and I think it is a somewhat more sensitive and perhaps humorous approach to the problem of keeping people from taking rubbings off of the various slate tombstones and essentially wearing them away to the point of nothing. There's one particularly nice word in there. I think it's snallyyow, which I guess is supposed to be a dog. At any rate, we've come around the curve, and zap, you get the Boston City Hall. It was the result of a winner of a competition which was held in 1962, designed by Coleman and McKinnell. I had the good fortune when I was in school to watch the building from the point where it was nothing more than a hole in the ground to its completion. And it was a fascinating thing. I had a friend in the architecture studio, and I used to go down at regular intervals, and I remember vividly one New Year's Eve, and it was snowing like hell in Boston. And we just took it in our heads that we'd go down and see how the City Hall was doing. And we popped onto the scene, and they had just about gotten it up to the point where they, what you might call the cornice stories, were beginning to happen. And there were all kinds of projections in every direction. It was lit by floodlights through the snow, and it's like Paul Rudolph says, it's a building that's going to make a beautiful ruin. What we're going to do, and you can see in this aerial photograph, we're approaching Government Center from the lower right corner of the picture. One Center Plaza, which I've just referred to, is a very dimly lit arc in the foreground. The oldest structure, which is with a curved facade, which you see in the right-hand corner, is the Sears Crescent, very nicely restored area, and now filled with offices and little restaurants and boutiques and things, very nicely done. We're going to go past the front of that, then cut clear across the front of the City Hall over to the Federal Building, which was one of Tack's lesser efforts, and through a rather nice grove of trees, which is in front of the Federal Building, and around the back side of the City Hall, over to Faneuil Hall, which is the very small building to the rear, and down past the New Quincy Market, and eventually from there down to the waterfront. The whole space has a tremendous effect when you first encounter it. It's one of the City Hall itself is one of the few buildings I've ever seen completed that looks as good in reality as it did in the rendering. The rather strange little truncated pyramid in the foreground is an entrance to the MBTA, Massachusetts Bay Transit Authority. It's one of the four major nodes of the entire transit system in Boston, and is particularly fortunate that it happens in this location. Some rather nice things have been retained in these small restored buildings. I was telling you about the little tea kettle whistle steam, just like it did when it was not restored, and this was Scully Square, which was the local red light district. We move down a little bit past there, heading toward the corner of the building. You can see Faneuil Hall in the background. Originally, there was supposed to be a bridge over the street which divides the Faneuil Hall area from the City Hall Square. Unfortunately, it was budgeted out of existence. I'm hoping that someday they'll restore it to the budget, because it's a real interruption to have to hassle your way across 8 lanes of traffic in this case to get to that the Faneuil Hall district. This is a little mall which opens off the side here. You can see the large high-rise, which is New England Merchants National Bank, I believe. It's designed by, let's see, Emery Roth, I think. And and Edward Larrabee Barnes at the end of the 60s, rather nicely detailed, and the arcade centers on what was the main entrance of the old State House. At any rate, getting back to the City Hall Square, this is the major facade of One Center Plaza, the large curved building which I mentioned before. As you move toward the City Hall, you begin to get an idea of its rather enormous scale. You're not really aware of it when you see it from a distance, but when you start to get close up, it really turns into quite a huge structure. And I think they've done the architects really did an incredible job in keeping it from overwhelming the space. It has presence to dominate the space and serve as kind of the fulcrum around a pivot, around which the whole thing revolves. But it's still not one of these horrible municipal efforts at architecture that has given that kind of architecture such a bad name. I remember vividly when the winning design was announced, an editorial in the Boston Globe, a very unfavorable editorial, showed something like this view of the thing: an architect standing on one side looking delighted, and a pigeon standing on the other looking equally delighted. I don't think they've had too much troubles like that. The scale of the space is really quite huge. They had a special bicentennial display up, lots of hanging banners, that sort of thing. Unfortunately, I was there at an off hour. Normally the space, not normally, but most of the time, the space looks like this, without too many people. But of course, at quitting time and at any of the rallies or demonstrations for which Boston is famous, I've seen photographs and television footage of this thing completely filled with people. At the corner, you can't see it because it's in shadow, and the aerial shot is a rather nice fountain. Very lavish use of water. Again, pedestrians are encouraged to get in there and get their feet wet, which most of them do, and they have a really rather good time. Now we're going to move toward the Federal Building. This was one of the first completed structures in the Government Center. TAC building, as I said, one of their lesser efforts. I don't think Boston has ever really quite forgiven them for it. I'm not sure why they designed it the way they did. It's certainly the least effective building in the entire complex. You can see various shots of the bollards which they've used throughout the area to delineate steps or boundaries from automobile and pedestrian areas. And as you get in front of the Federal Building, you find what, for my money, is the best part of it, this rather nice grove of trees that they planted in front of it, and which is heavily used at most times of day. We're now moving around the back, what is, as far as we're concerned from this viewpoint, the back side of the structure, and I think it's time to change trays after this shot. We're looking back toward Tremont Street, which is how we arrived. On the right is One Center Plaza, on the left is the Sears Crescent. Next tray. Okay, we're going to move, one final look at the architecture of the City Hall, and we'll turn our attention down this staircase where you'll begin to get a good view of Faneuil Hall. Very old structure, another bullfinch structure, or at least remodeled by bullfinch, and this has just been completely restored, I believe, by the Architects Collaborative under the direction of Ben Thompson, and whom I think have redeemed themselves totally for their problems with the federal building by the really excellent job they've done on this. The whole area was completely redone, repaved. Granite, I would debate as to how many cities in this country you'll see granite crosswalks that have been installed within the last 50 years. Granite paving throughout with brick accents. Another one of the little kiosks that I mentioned to you before. And what we're going to do is come around the backside of City Hall along the right-hand wall of the Faneuil Hall and move down through the Quincy Market area, which you can see in the foreground of the picture. The work was still going on. This was the only completed portion when I was there. It was, I believe, completed shortly thereafter. These two long parallel blocks on either side of the Quincy Market structure are still undergoing renovation and won't be complete, I believe, until next year. The market itself, the gray granite structure with the dome, was designed by Alexander Paris in 1824 till 26, and is now, I believe, virtually complete. It's been officially opened and completely restored to its market and now boutique function. A lot of work being done on the detailing of the area. As I said, a lot of use of granite. You can begin to get a feeling for the impact City Hall has when seen from this side. In case it hasn't been apparent, there was considerable fall across the site of City Hall Square. And even while the construction was actually going on, they were having the flag, and there were various things that were going on, historic events, that sort of thing, that were being depicted in the area. They're using solid granite pavers being hoisted into place, mortar and sand mix. Every effort seems to have been made to do something that was in the spirit of the original and use the same family of materials, if not duplicating the original. We've now moved along the backside of Faneuil Hall, and we're going to move down this long parallel row, which I believe is 600 feet of the market itself. And in the background you can see the infamous Fitzgerald Expressway, which was slashed right through the heart of Boston in the late 40s and early 50s. Like the Embarcadero Freeway in San Francisco, there is some talk of tearing it down or possibly depressing it. Anything would be an improvement, as you'll soon see. As we move down the line of buildings, you can look back and see how the Beacon Hill is in the background, and the additive rise in height of the various structures is a result of topography as well as architecture. This is the Fitzgerald Expressway. They pulled down Paradise and put up a parking lot, I guess is what I would have to say about it. It's ugly, it's unsafe, it's hard to drive on. It is a real terror if you've never driven it before. Fortunately, I learned to drive in Boston, so it wasn't too hard for me. But I've heard people come out of that place with the first time they've been exposed to it and just wish that they had twice as much insurance as they have. But anyway, you eventually get under the darn thing, and as you get out on the other side, here's a view of it seen from the Customs House Tower. You encounter the new waterfront park, which has just been completed, designed by Sasaki's office, and very nicely done. I have a few qualms about the little egg crate structure, again with the usual identifying kiosk. These, incidentally, structures in the background are old granite warehouses that are now been converted for offices and apartments. I think one of the charming things about the area is that there's still a certain degree of dilapidation side by side with the restored units, and it's kind of fun to see the two cheek by jowl if you like that sort of thing. In theory, this is eventually going to be covered with vegetation, in which case I think it will be a very distinct addition to the area. It's very little tree life in it as it stands now. I have no idea what is intended for the large open area in the left foreground of the left screen, but the rest of it has been quite intensively developed. Simply but rather nicely detailed. The structure itself is extremely interesting to look at, and it will be left pretty much to weather to a natural color. Whoops. As you move under the little arbor affair, and you can see this cluster of rather strange wood forms and a fountain in the background as you get over toward those warehouses. It's just a public space, lots of kids playing, enjoying themselves. The skyline literally piling up in the background as you turn 180 degrees from the previous shot. Again, the various restored warehouse structures in the background. Hordes of children all having a wonderful time. And in this particular shot, in the background of the two waterfront apartment towers that I believe were a Pei structures also. He has good representation in Boston. We're going to start moving out of the park and along the edge of the harbor, which is we'll get a shot of in just a moment. It has been rather nicely detailed. They've kept the granite paving and the brick, rather heavy use of chains, needless to say. I'm inclined to think that this might be overdoing it a little bit as far as let's be nautical. But it's apropos, and there is a lot of boat traffic in the area, so it doesn't seem too out of place. One of the local touring boats leaves from this area. We're going to move along this, and this group of structures which you see now is in the lower left portion of the screen. The building on the right-hand side, the contemporary structure, is the Boston Aquarium, designed by the Cambridge 7 Associates. Very fine structure. Again, a nice use of concrete. And in the background of the picture, of course, is Logan International Airport. I did not have time at the day I was there to go inside the structure. It's one of my to-be-continued type things. I've seen photographs of the interior, and it's really dramatic. So if any of you are ever there, don't hesitate to pay a visit to it. These are the two apartment towers that I believe are designed by Pei, and these two structures pretty much end the portion of the waterfront that has been restored, or let us say revitalized for human use. There are a number of plans in the offing. In the background is the old Boston Navy Yard, and that is now being planned to be recycled as a design and crafts center. And unfortunately you can't see it from here, but that inlet of water goes in a considerable distance, and I believe, well, they've been planning great things for that for years. Whether they get it off the ground or not remains to be seen. That pretty much concludes the tour, so to speak. I hope you enjoyed it. I don't have any great conclusions to draw from it. It's merely a travelogue, and this is what Boston looks like in the year 1976. I hope you all want to go there.